Okay, thank you for joining us again. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. I'm Jonathan Bar-El, Consul for Public Diplomacy here at our consulate in Los Angeles. And welcome to our next program on Israel Connect webinar series, where we try to bring Israel to the Pacific Southwest coast. And what a program do we have for you today? We're going to take some break from all the politics and the elections and even the peace agreement in the Middle East. And we're going to have a fascinating discussion about Israeli art. And to do that, we have assembled an amazing panel. We're going to speak about Israeli art with the people who collect it, who teach it, curate it, collect it, and review it. So it's going to be fascinating. We're going to hear a lot about the relationship between the Israeli art and the multifaceted society it represents, and also impact. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun. And we encourage you as well to post some questions at the button below, and we will try to get them and to answer them as we can. We want you to be part of this discussion. Before we start, I want to thank my team, Caroline Benatan, Rachel More, and Hope Bunshaft for helping us and making this Israel Connect webinar series comes to life. I also want to thank our partners for this webinar series, helping us promote it and spreading it out and bringing your audiences. We have a lot to do today. We're going to keep, as always, to our 1 hour mark. So let's start, and let me introduce who's here with us today so we can get going. So first of all, we have with us Sagi Refael. Hi, Sagi, how are you?
Hey, Sagi, great, how are you?
Yeah. Great, thank you for joining us. Sagi is an Israeli art historian, curator, writer, and advisor to collectors and artists. He's based here in Los Angeles and teaches Israeli art at the American Hebrew University. In 2017, he founded IAILA, Israeli Art in Los Angeles, a private initiative dedicated to cultural exchange and artistic cross-pollination between Israel and USA, and it has the coolest name. It's also a great pleasure to have with us for this panel Anne and Ari Rosenblatt, that are among the most important and well-regarded collectors of Israeli art in the US, and are also founders of an eponymous annual prize given to artists in Israel, presenting unique innovation, relevance, and excellence. Hi, Anne and Ari, great to have you with us. How are you? Okay, I hope you can hear us.
Yes, hi, we are happy to be part of this.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for your beautiful, I must say, house. I would also mention that the Rosenblatt collection is based here in Beverly Hills in their house, as I said, and holdings of it are being loaned to exhibitions in museums and other institutions on a regular basis. And we also have with us, it's a pleasure to have Edward Goldman as well. Hi, Edward, how are you?
Good afternoon, Jonathan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining, Edward. I just tell you guys that Edward has been an art critic for over 30 years and was the host of Art Talk, which the program that appeared on NPR. He was born and educated in Russia and formerly employed by the famed Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. He offers views on what he sees in galleries and museums and at cultural events throughout the world. Edward, it's great having you with us today.
My pleasure.
So without further ado, as I said, we have a lot to discuss. And I'm going to pass the mic now to Sagi. Sagi will start by taking us on a tour to the Israeli art world, I would say, through the history, the trends, and the characteristics of the different eras in Israeli art. Then we will jump into the fascinating discussion I promised you with all of our esteemed panelists. Sagi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, Hope, and thank you to the entire staff of the Consulate General of Israel for hosting this event. As Jonathan said, I founded IAILA, Israeli Art in Los Angeles, in 2017. in order to create a platform that would present the cultural sides of Israel that are not often seen, not outside of Israel, and too often not even inside of Israel. Generally thinking about the role of art, and in case it actually has a role, I believe that artists are not only meant to be making beautiful objects, they can be also agents of change. Artists are often more sensitive to gentle shifts in culture, to injustices. They're sensitive to conventions that, despite being morally wrong, are nevertheless embedded in society. Often, artists see the world in a nuanced way and not in black and white. In some societies, they are being perceived as a threat, even traitors, because they don't accept the wrongs that other people are too tired to fight. Artists might be pointing at a truth that is not the truth being promoted by politicians. This is happening in Israel, in the United States, and in many other countries where the field of culture is trying to take society forward, while people in positions of power are trying to keep society backwards, confined by religion and tradition. Often these are just excuses to keep themselves in those positions of power and control. May I have the next slide, please? May I have the next slide? Thank you. A conflict that is rooted in the cultural identity of the Israeli society is the fact that the state of Israel is a Jewish state by definition, although over 1 million of its citizens are not Jewish. The state is located in the Middle East, surrounded by Arab countries, predominantly Muslim. But the Israeli culture had often wanted to perceive itself as Western, looking at Western Europe and the United States as sources of inspiration, validation, and acceptance, and as examples of the true potential of excellence that the Israeli society can strive for. The poet and philosopher Yehuda Halevi, who lived in Spain in the 12th century, is famous for writing in one of his poems, "My heart is in the East, and I am in the uttermost West," meaning that he is in the diaspora, craving to arrive at the Holy Land. The perception, or this perception, has very much changed through the process of establishing the State of Israel, as if to say, we are in the Middle East, but our hearts are in the Western Europe and in the United States. May I have the next slide? Thank you. An idea that stood at the heart of creating the Jewish state was to establish a new kind of Jew, in contrast to the Jew who was a victim of anti-Semitism and pogroms. This new Jew will return to its biblical land and connect with its roots, while becoming a healthy, powerful Jew. If I need to summarize it briefly in words we often hear these days, the new Jew was meant to be a winner, not a loser. May I have the next slide? Thanks. Some of the artists in then Palestine and later the State of Israel embarked on a mission to create this new culture. And through their artwork, we can see the emergence of Tel Aviv from the sand, the joy of erecting something new, or connecting to the holiness and mystic atmosphere of ancient Jerusalem. To this day, there are differences between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as if they are representing two approaches in the Israeli society. Jerusalem is religious, soaked in history and tradition, while Tel Aviv is secular, liberal, and young at heart. Here we see a woodcut by Meir Sima and a painting by Rubin. Next slide, please. May I have the next slide? Thanks. Israeli society, history, and culture are being created both as an evidence to what happened, but also as a way we wish to see ourselves. For example, in the question of the necessity of war, those who died at war while defending the land were meant to be memorized as heroes. But some artists had already started questioning that heroism and suggested that these are actually victims of unnecessary circumstances. I'm reminding you that the state of Israel wanted to be an example of the new Jew, the hero. So suggesting that these heroes are actually victims cracked the solid identity that was being built. And this crack, which was very small in the first 50 years since the establishment of Israel, started growing bigger and bigger. May I have the next slide? Thanks. In 1948, the year in which the State of Israel was officially established, a group of artists decided to embrace the universal language of art, the abstraction. No more representational depictions of locality, but instead they promoted a desire to be seen as part of the international avant-garde, speaking in neutral terms of color, brushstroke, and composition. Next slide, please. By resisting a sentimental narrative that is connected to Judaism or to the building of the new country, the New Horizons group wished to be, in fact, Western, just like the cutting-edge painters in Paris and New York. Next slide. Quickly moving forward to Israeli art today, artists refer to the Israeli reality and raise deep questions regarding Israel's past, present, and future. For example, the myth of Israel as David and its surrounding countries as Goliath. The question that is being asked is, can Israel be this small victim when it's proud of being a tech nation, financially successful, and an example of being triumphant against all odds? Can Israel still play the card of being both David, therefore a young boy and a potential victim, and at the same time to be a hero? The question of the use of power is being frequently asked by Israeli artists, and not only in the context of the Palestinian conflict. For example, is the sacrifice of soldiers still necessary, or should it be questioned and doubted? Here we see two photographs. One is staged by Adina and one photojournalism by Pavel Warburg. Next slide, please. Thank you. Other questions started to be asked. For example, why has the role of Mizrahi and Sephardi cultures been repressed from Israeli history and culture? How come the state of Israel is being led predominantly by Ashkenazi white males? And was it a good idea to promote the agenda of the melting pot, by which the state of Israel is a clean slate and so should be its new citizens, intentionally erasing their histories, traditions, and otherness in order to accommodate a predominantly Western-oriented culture? Next slide, please. The question of beauty and acceptance is marked by, I chose the question of beauty in order to visually depict how Israel sees itself as a state that can accommodate the other. For example, the white, blonde immigrant from the former USSR, or the Israeli Arab, but as long as she doesn't seem to be perceived as a threat. Okay, dressing her in a dress with a Star of David. Next slide, please. The question of beauty and acceptance is marked by this crucial cover of Studio magazine, a publication that was often perceived as elitist, but now bearing the appearance of a fashion magazine, blurring the lines between high culture and low culture, and literally the face of Israeliness. This is an image, a photograph by David Adika, and it is in the collection of Anne and Ari Rosenblatt, and we're going to discuss it later. Next slide, please. In the In the last 2 decades, a lot has changed in the Israeli art scene. More independent artist-run spaces have been offering an alternative to museums and commercial galleries. More and more young artists are embracing their family's Mizrahi and Sephardic heritage, personal stories, and traumas, and make art that is accepted by mainstream institutions. Next slide. This is Vered Nissim. More and more women artists are questioning their position in society and in their own families, confronting tradition and religion. This is a painting by Orit Akta design. Next slide, please. More and more artists who are considered to be part of the other communities of the Israeli society are sharing their stories and social commentaries. For example, Zoya Cherkassky-Nadi in this image, and next slide, please. One of Israel's most successful, popular, and important artists, Zoya Cherkassky-Nadi, had a blockbuster solo exhibition at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem last year, sharing her family's and the community of the Russian immigrants, or Olim, to Israel, in her successful exhibition. Next slide. Nirit Takele, a very successful painter of an Ethiopian heritage, is creating a pioneering work as a woman of color, speaking about racism in the Israeli society and history, but also suggests a sense of pride, strength, and independence. Next slide, please. Beating of the Israeli soldier. Next slide, please. Michal Mamit Vorka, also of an Ethiopian heritage, recently had a solo exhibition at the Herzliya Museum and is the recipient of the Presser Family Award. She had a solo exhibition. Next slide, please. And also Tigist Yosef Ron, a recipient of the Schiff Award in 2019, has a solo exhibition right now at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art in Tel Aviv. Next slide. Israeli Arab artists, or those that identify as Palestinians, mainly women artists, are being shown finally in mainstream museums, commenting on domestic violence, the position of the woman in a traditional and religious society, while also referring to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its origins. This is an image of an installation by Hanan Abu Hussein. Next slide. An installation by Nardin Sarouji. Next slide. Nardin Sarouji and Meir Pichhadze both commenting on the identity of the displaced person. Next slide. One of the Israeli art scene's most talked about artists of recent years, Samach Shehadi, who is also featured with several works in the collection of Anenari Rosenblatt, with whom we're going to talk in a minute. Samach Shehadi, also next slide. Her solo exhibition at the Tel Aviv Museum last year. Next slide. And Anisa Ashkar, a leading figure in Israel's art scene for 2 decades already, an Israeli Arab woman artist whose work is dealing with matters of feminism, tradition, and empowerment. Anisa is also the recipient of the Rosenblatt Prize for Visual Arts in Israel, and I would like to invite Anne and Ari Rosenblatt to join this conversation.
Hi there.
Hey, Rosenblatt. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide. So as I said, Anisa Ashkar is the 2020 winner of the Anne and Ari Rosenblatt Prize for Visual Art in Israel. Can we see the next slide? So first of all, thank you so much for being here and for being such amazing ambassadors of Israeli art in Israel, in the United States, in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills, and everybody loves you in the Israeli art community, and I love you very much. So tell us a bit about how you actually started your collection, why Israeli art, and why forming this prize in Israel.
Okay. Hi. About 15 years ago, we started to spend more and more time because of family reasons in Israel. We always had very close ties to Israel. But with spending more and more time in Israel, we started to explore the Israeli art scene and did it also with curators. We visited museums, galleries, artists, and we were blown away and we fell in love with the Israeli art scene as being the most powerful, high quality art that we could imagine. And we felt, because of what you said, all the different variants that represent Israeli society were there. And we were so deeply moved by it and by the quality that we got more and more involved, and over the years became very passionate about it and decided to focus exclusively on showing Israeli art and trying everything we can to bring this side of Israel out into the world and into the public, and to share it with as many people as we can. So that's why Israeli art. The art prize, Ari will explain, came out of that as a thank you to the artists.
We felt that being in a fortunate position that we are, that we can afford to collect, we can afford to travel, we felt like a special thing in our heart to be able to give something back to Israel. Other people buy trees, other people donate to hospitals. Our part of giving back to Israel was establishing a prize for artists, and by now everybody knows that artists always have some financial constraints, and we heard and found out that there is always a prize for the promising and sexy young artists. There's always a prize for the artists who unfortunately reach the age and may not be able to work or live that longer. So our aim was to support and have a prize for mid-career artists that have exhibited and are waiting for the breakthrough of their first solo show in a museum, in an area that they will have exposure. And this year, Anisa is our 5th recipient of that prize.
We also wanted to make sure to not have the prize associated with any institutionalized museum, in order to give our artists the opportunity to be without any restrictions. And the prize is connected with a financial prize with some money, so they don't have to produce commercial art. They really can bring their art form, whatever it is, to a different level without having to consider that it has to be sellable. So that gives them hopefully the opportunity to go up to another level in their art creating.
Fantastic, and I think that in 5 years, here we see 2 invitations to the exhibitions of Shaili Uziel and Reuven Cooperman. Other recipients are Ella Mitai Sadovsky, Roy Victoria Hefetz, and this year, Anisa Ashkar. Jonathan, can we move on to the next slide? Yes.
Sagi, the only thing is that you see here in this invitation, for example, Cooperman presented some classic paintings, and you know, the art that you expect to see was a totally different twist, a little bit of Japanese mythology. But Shaili Uziel was our 2nd prize winner, and his application was literally drawn on a little napkin, but we love the concept because everybody who has visited Tel Aviv in the last couple of years knows that Tel Aviv is in upheaval and the subway is being built and traffic is bad and even worse now. And Shaili basically, in the big gallery place, built a virtual subway station. There was nothing to sell. There was nothing to take home, but he got amazing reviews and basically captured the spirit of Tel Aviv at that particular time.
Amazing. Jonathan, if we can move forward with the slides. I think that we're a bit behind time, so we can run these. We can see here works by David Adika, which we talked about before, or I talked about before, Beauty, the portrait of Meir Adana, Adines on the far right, Ori Gersh. Jonathan, you can go through the slides, and I would like to ask Ari Enan, what, Pavel Wahlberg, or Barry Friedlander, I'm sorry, what, Ann and Ari, what makes you fall in love with an artwork, and what makes you choose one over the other? Is the collection a historical collection, a private, like graphical collection? Tell us a bit about the themes maybe you have in the collection.
No, our collection is really a personal collection. The art we collect has to move us. It has to kick us in the gut. It has to stay with us. So it doesn't have to be necessarily beautiful. It has to be powerful. It has to say something. And so that is our main criteria. And then we try, when we like an artist and we think the artist has merit, we try to get the best work of them possible. And our collection's goal is to really represent all of Israel. As I said, we want to try to, as much as possible, show the Israeli art scene, and through that Israeli society, without any political agenda from any side being influenced by it, but to show all of what we think Israel is about. So we try to collect really all across the board and not be limited by the media, and just to get the best work possible of whatever we want to show.
So you also live with art very much. So your house is packed with art and you rotate it a few times a year. What does it feel like living with Israeli art? Does it have like a personal connection to the artists, to Israel, to your histories? You know, when I first walked into your home a few years ago, it felt like being in Israel, surrounded by my friends in the art community. What does it feel? What does it feel like for you? And how do your friends, some of them are collectors of non-Israeli art, how do they respond to your collection?
Yeah.
Well, first you spoke about our feelings. Since we buy what the first rule as a collector, you have to agree with your wife. So we both choose and decide on buying the things, and we both have to love it. And the nice thing is that most, and I would say 80 or 90% of the object and art pieces that we buy by now in the last many years directly from the artist, if it being through a gallery or agents or whatever. We know most of the artists, and the fun part and the interesting part is to see artists in the beginning of the career, to see artists growing, to see how they change their style and evolve. And the nice thing having all this art in the house is that literally we are reliving our trips to Israel. We know exactly which piece we bought at which time of the year and at which year and at which event. And it enhances our memory and gives us great satisfaction to know that we were not the typical tourist going to Israel and just sit on the beach and drink coffee, you know, on the street. So it gives us also great satisfaction that we know that we not only helped at that particular time to help the artists pay their rent, but we have seen them evolve, we have seen them being published, And it makes us feel as a team and as a contributor to a society that unfortunately we live far away.
I don't know if we have time or not, but I am curious. Maybe it's going to be the last question. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to show more images. What advice will you give to someone that, you know, wants to start collecting art, or maybe already is an art collector, and would have to put his or her money somewhere in an artwork? Why would he or she decide to buy Israeli art and not, I don't know, an emerging Chinese artist? It might be a tricky question, so I apologize for putting you on the spot.
No, it's not a tricky question. I think first you have to love art. There are some people who live in small, beautiful, large or small houses who care more about furniture or care more about the aesthetics of having white walls. For us, white walls means they need to be filled with art because we love it. So once you love the art and you want to be a collector, you certainly want to have a theme, be it a country, be it a subject. If anybody likes Israeli art, I would say to him, please reach out to us, come and look at all the different styles and artists that we have collected. But if you go to Israel, our big advice and passionate advice is that unfortunately, the art scene in Israel is not in your face unless you go in Tel Aviv and just see the graffiti painted all over. And that definitely sticks in your face. But I would very much encourage that people speak to somebody like you and us and find out that there are not only galleries that are on the main streets. There are a lot of hidden areas of artist colonies in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, where there are buildings of 300 to 400 artists in one place with small little non-profit galleries. And I would say before you seriously either buy or want to become a collector, visit as many galleries and artists, look at museums, get educated, and then try and make your choices.
And Israeli art. And why Israeli art? Israeli art is such a treasure chest of different styles and different medias, and the quality is really world class, and it is affordable. So you can also go from that standpoint. And I think because of the political and the environment in Israel, it's very raw and it can really grab you. And it makes it worth to surround yourself with it. I mean, we are very subjective, obviously.
I don't know, just last sentence from me, because I have so many friends who are artists in Israel and curators. If anyone wants to support the positive voices in Israel, please buy art from Israeli artists. You know, Israel has a lot of faces. It has good qualities, maybe amazing qualities, maybe things that we want to support and enhance, things that we don't want to support. Please consider supporting Israeli artists because they can be and are the best ambassadors of the best that Israel has to offer. So thank you for this, and thank you, Ari and Anne. And I think that we should proceed to Edward.
So Anne and Ari, I wanted to tell you that having a privilege to be in your house several months ago with Sagi and Jonathan and see your collection and hear your story about your collection, I want to tell you that I had, through the years of being in Los Angeles, visiting dozens of private collectors' houses. And though sometimes you see very high quality of the art, but when people travel around the world and they can afford to buy whatever appeals to them, they create good collection. But it's rather rare to have collectors who have a focus in their collecting. And you know, the fact that you chose from the very beginning to concentrate on the art of particular subject and theme, you know, make your collection very special for me. I'm just learning not only about you, but about Israel and about Israel art. And with that, I know that I have only a few minutes. I want just to mention my so far only first and only trip to Israel. I was part of the Los Angeles cultural delegations, which was kind of informed and shaped by Nancy Berman, famous Los Angeles also art collector and former director of Skillable Cultural Center. And Nancy brought us to both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and we've seen museums, we've seen public art, we went to see some private collectors. But what I remember in Jerusalem, we went to Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. And I was told that it's the best known art school in Israel. And I was absolutely amazed by the quality of the exhibition. It was exhibition at the end of the year of the students who graduating from the school, from academy. And if I didn't know that I'm in an art school, I thought I'm in a museum. I see the absolutely museum quality of work of the young Israeli artists. One more thing was unusual. I remember saying that, you know what, it's not only quality of the art, but very high intellectual way of presentation. Installation was done like you expect in the museums. And director of the school told me, yes, Edward, when we do this exhibition, we invite one of the magic art curators from our museums, and this curator is creating this presentation so my young students understand what it means to work with the museum professionals. I haven't seen anything like that done in any of the top American art schools. So I remember that as one of my high points of learning something traveling in Israel. Okay, meanwhile, I want to show a few artworks that I've seen in Los Angeles, thanks to Shoshana Wayne Gallery, I was introduced to two artists, Israeli artists who live outside of Israel and who just absorb everything which is happening in the world. And let's start with the first slide. It's Zadok Ben David installation at the Shoshana Wayne Gallery, which used to be Central Gallery at Bergamot Station. And what you see, and you might be a little bit amazed and slightly even confused, it's the gallery floor covered with several tons of the sand and several dozens of the figures, metal figures cut out of aluminum, based on Zadok Ben David traveling around the world. He is just non-stop traveler. He just wants to know the people and art and culture, and he photographs these people. And after that, each of this portrait of the people whom he met during the traveling, he is just cutting out of the aluminum and stick it into the sand. So what you see is a crowd of people. It's the whole world. It's not only people in Israel, it's the whole world of people staring at you, you staring at them. And just look at some of these details. I've seen his installation on a large scale. I've seen his installation on a smaller scale, and even few figures just hold your attention and stays with you. And I remember when I've seen his works first time in Shoshana Wayne Gallery, I brought my class. I used to do before pandemic, every few weeks, take a group of people. I call it Fine Art of Art Collecting. And we are going to the studios of the artists, private collections, museums, looking at the public art. And one of the people in my class loved his work so much that they invited him to their house in Malibu. And he created for them a wonderful installation of several hundreds of the butterflies cut out of the metal just attached to the wall of one of the staircase at the entrance of their house. So here to the left, you see a life-size sculpture of the figure. I would assume there's a male figure, but it's not important. And each of them done with the butterflies. And it's amusing, it's amazing. And it's one of these artworks that you not only look at that, but you are tempted to touch with your eyes and to touch with your fingers. And I have to admit that I allow myself to touch it with my fingers, and it's just delight, difficult to describe. Okay, so that's what we see. And now I want to switch to another artist, to Michal Rovner. I've seen Michal Rovner works again in a couple of the exhibitions that Shoshana Wayne Gallery introduced. And she is the artist who making videos on a large scale. You see, for example, here, the whole wall in the Shoshana Wayne Gallery, and you have video projections, and you see at the bottom tiny figures, male and female figures walking, and above them, like a diptych, semi-abstract painting, a video, and it's everything moving and breathing. And the way I describe it in my program for National Public Radio for KCRW Right Station, I said, let me quote myself, if you ever stood in front of the famous 2,000-year-old Rosetta Stone at the British Museum and fantasize what it would be like to not only read its inscription in 3 different languages, but also to hear these languages spoken and even to see it in the process of being written, then, my friends, I have an adventure for you that will turn all this fantasy into reality. So I suggested to people to see this exhibition and to see a variety of the works. And there is some kind of combination of sense of theater and dance and moving and sound. And sometimes it's on a smaller scale, like this on a double screens attached to each other. And you see these people walking through what I would describe biblical landscape, one kind of timeless landscape that everyone, wherever you live, whatever your religion is, you can relate to. Mm-hmm. And that kind of universal appeal of the art of these 2 Israeli artists. And when I looked at the presentation that Sagi, you've done so well, and many of the artists, I wish you would take me to the studio to see the exhibition, because, you know, there is something, it's not only in reference to what's happening right now in Israel, it just what's happening in the world. Because I look at these works and I see and I hear the voices of these artists, even if they speak in Hebrew, and unfortunately I don't speak Hebrew, but I understand the visual language. And that's so powerful and inspiring for me. Okay, and I just want to mention one thing before we end. Several years ago, I was asked to join a group of people in commemoration of Holocaust Remembrance Day in the Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And several dozens of us were asked to read only one page from Elie Wiesel memoirs, Night. And that's what's my kind of one of the most profound personal, or if you say Jewish experience, being atheist. I'm on the biggest and the most important for me, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, Los Angeles-based synagogue, and I'm reading from Elie Wiesel memoirs, and I think about my late parents who went through so much during the World War II. My father who lost all his family in Poland during the World War II. And I'm still alive in Los Angeles, and I'm looking at art, and I'm thinking about my trip to Israel, and I'm thinking about what you and Ari have been talking about, great art in your collection. And Sagi, you with your knowledge and reference. And Jonathan, it was such a pleasure to meet with you several months ago when we went to Anne and Ari house. And Anne and Ari, I hope that we all continue to be well and safe, and soon enough it will be safe enough for me to visit you one more time. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for your remarks, and thank you everyone for this wonderful presentation. We're not done yet, don't worry. Just want to mention that, yes, of course, COVID is influencing all of us, and I really hope that soon we will be able to see Israeli art in galleries, as Edward shown us a few examples of some exhibitions that were here in Los Angeles. Thank you, guys. We're now going to move to the open part of the Q&A. We have some questions. Well, most of the remarks on the chat, people are saying that they want to see more works. So Sagi, you know, that's I think you got people there, you got them interested, and maybe Rachel, maybe we can show some works from the presentation from Anne and Ari collection while we speak now, because no matter what we will say, I think the art speaks better for herself. And but I do want to ask you some questions, and we got a few questions from the audience. We got two questions that are similar in a way, so I'll just ask them together and feel free to answer as you see fit. So the first question is, whom do you credit? Who was the first Israeli artist to break through onto the international stage, and why? When and why? And the second question, this is maybe from your competition, from another collector, is asking, whom should we be watching? Whom will be the next star of the Israeli art scene? So guys, take it from here.
Sagi, you go first.
Wow, the first star that, you know, the first star, you know, it really depends. Bezalel artisans, you know, marketed their creations to collectors or to Jewish supporters in the United States and abroad. So their work already in the beginning of the 20th century. Artists that had independent careers, you know, Yosef Zaritsky was one of the leaders in the New Horizon movement, had a solo exhibition at the Zadok Museum in the Netherlands in the early 50s. You know, it's really hard to, Abel Pan, you know, was collected. So there are a lot of early examples about who is the new star. You know, I believe that quality stands the test of time. So there is so much talent, that there are so many amazing artists in Israel. Because it's a small market, someone who is a star today might not be a star in 3 years' time. So my best advice would be to look around to see what you like, what you love, what you need to live with, have to live with, and buy it. And stars or not stars, the artwork will stand the test of time if you love it. So that would be probably my best advice. Rosenblatt?
I would add also to it that, you know, everybody's star is somebody else's star, and star fade and new stars are being discovered. Luckily, art is in the art of the beholder, but I do think that Israeli art is upcoming. There are luckily still, even with budget problem, a lot of great art schools. I think we will see a lot more international recognition to the old guard and the new guard. And I think what's happening now is that in Israel, as you previously have shown, Sagi, that immigrants who have now gone to schools, and we see new stars, Ethiopian, Palestinian, Israeli, Arabs who were in the background before and were hesitant to show in Israel, are showing now in Israel, and there's a lot of new talent that will be exposed.
Thank you.
Just one last sentence about this is that, you know, there are artists who are already established and are in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and people are overlooking their work. They're still active, but people are overlooking their work because once you're looking for an emerging star, you might overlook someone who is already an older artist. So I would advise look at all ages, all genders, all skin tones, and all religions, and see who you like.
Yeah, I would just say that maybe sometimes you do need this star to help the international committee to shift their focus into Israeli art in a whole. And I want to touch upon what Ari just mentioned now, and Sagi, you also mentioned it when you spoke about the contemporary trends of Israeli art. So you mentioned the inclusion of, I would say, the different ethnic groups of Israeli society, such as Ethiopian artists and Israeli Arab artists. So I guess my question is, what would you say, or well, it's open to everyone as well, what are the most important trends in today Israeli art?
Sagi, you're the best qualified to answer this.
I don't like the word trend, because you know, it says that, you know, these artists are here now and are not going to be here in 2 years.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not talking about trendy artists. I'm talking about like what are the, you know, the process, the process of that Israeli art is undergoing.
Yeah, I can say that in the past 2 decades, there is more and more. There are more and more active artists from communities, I would say, that are or had been actively marginalized. So those that were not active did not go to art schools or were coming from lower socioeconomical classes, all sorts of reasons. We didn't really see them in the canon of art history. And that can be women artists of color, you know, artists from immigrating communities, Israeli Arabs or Palestinians, as I said, so religious artists of faith, Orthodox communities. So, you know, we see more and more artists and more schools opening, and students that are active in the Israeli art scene that we didn't really see. We did see examples here and there, but in the past 2 decades, I would say, or 15 years, more and more artists from communities that are marginalized are being seen, and their work is actually, it grows and it gets better and better. They become more professional, and their stories, these are stories that were not told, had not been told. So they are coming with new stories. And so all of the above.
In addition, I totally agree with Sagi that those are coming out. Also, gender identity is becoming something that was not covered 20 years ago, and there are some incredible artists who take the subject matter into the arts in incredible ways in Israel. So that, in addition to what Sagi mentioned, is also, I think, very prevalent.
Great. So I think we will have to conclude it soon. So, but there is one last questions that we got here from the audience that I do want to touch upon, because it interests me as well. Again, I'm not sure it's an easy one to answer, but you'll do your best. So we are asked by someone who said, I'm interested in Israel's place in the global art scene, given that Israel is a bit of an exception in so many ways. I'll take that as a compliment. How does the New Jerusalem Biennale figure into this?
Sagi, that I leave to you.
These are actually two questions. To answer the first question about the place of Israeli artists in the global art scene, you know, there are successful Israeli artists or artists that are originally from Israel, like Michal, Rovner, like Zadok Ben David, like all sorts of artists that relocated to other art capitals like New York, like London, like other places, and they are successful. Michal Rovner had a solo show at the Whitney Museum. So there are many Israeli artists that, you know, I travel and I see their work in amazing galleries and museums. The Jerusalem Biennial, I actually had the pleasure of curating a group exhibition by LA-based Jewish artists at the Jerusalem Biennial last year. So the Jerusalem Biennial, I think it's a very important, significant, interesting, it's an interesting opportunity for artists that that don't find their place in a certain or in the art community or in the general art community, either don't find their place or are being rejected by the canon or by the mainstream of the art scene or the art field. So that is an interesting alternative to those artists showing their work. Israeli art in general, for many, many years, rejected the Jewish narrative for all sorts of reasons. I touched upon some of them. So the Jerusalem Biennial frames the work of artists that deal with Judaism in the work directly, and I think that this is its importance. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sagi. So as I promised, we've hit the 1 hour mark. We have a lot more questions, but most of the comments at the chat right now are from people that really wants to go to Israel and to explore Israeli art themselves. So I'm feeling that people are tired from the COVID and wants to fly back to Israel, and we want to bring Israeli artists back here to Los Angeles. So maybe for the meanwhile, maybe we'll have to do another art webinar, Sagi and everyone, and to show some more Israeli art in depth, because I think there's a lot of hunger for this here. And guys, I want to thank you. That was a fascinating discussion. That was so interesting.
Jonathan, let me just say, now yes, I'm listening to you and fantasizing that in a few months we will decide, all of us, fly to Israel and to see the art and report about that. Let's do that, guys. Let's do that. Be well.
I wish. Halevai ve'inshallah, as we say.
Jonathan, can I just quickly and lastly mention, if you're interested in Israeli art and the current art scene, Sagi can't say it himself, but he's giving a class at American Jewish University that covers Israeli contemporary art, where we do Zoom meetings with Israeli artists and galleries. If you want to learn about the current Israeli art scene, join through American Jewish University, the fall and winter program. He's amazing.
He is. I'll
Thank you
double that.
Much.
And it's a very important course. I agree. Thank you. And Anenari, thank you for the work you do with your collection, with the prize, with your annual competition. That's an amazing work. Thank you so much for being partners of Israel and of Israeli art. And I look forward for our next webinar together. Thank you all and stay safe.